Ambassador Kira Vasquez had spent 12 years working for the Galactic Diplomatic Corps, and she thought she had seen everything the universe could offer. But Way Station Omega-7 proved her wrong within the first hour of her arrival. The station was massive. A spinning wheel of metal and glass that floated in the empty space between three major trade routes. And it served as neutral ground for over 100 different alien species who came here to buy, sell, and make deals that would never be recorded in any official document. Kira walked through the crowded market district with her translator implant buzzing softly behind her ear, converting the chaos of alien languages into something her human brain could understand. And the smell of the place hit her like a wall made of every strange scent she had ever encountered mixed together into something almost unbearable. She passed stalls selling glowing fruits from jungle, worlds and weapons forged in the hearts of dying, stars and medicines that could cure diseases humans had not yet discovered, and poisons that could kill in ways humans had not yet imagined. Her mission here was simple enough. Just a routine inspection of cargo manifests to make sure no one was smuggling banned technology through the station. And she had been looking forward to finishing the job quickly and returning to her ship where the air did not taste like burned metal and alien sweat. That was when she heard the commotion. A crowd had gathered near the center of the market, and Kira could hear shouting and the clank of chains and something else underneath it all. A sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. Even though she could not identify what it was, she pushed through the crowd, using her diplomatic credentials to make aliens twice her size step aside. And what she saw when she reached the front made her stop breathing for a moment. A Vraxian merchant stood in the center of the open space, and Kira recognized the species immediately because Vraxians were hard to forget. 8 feet tall, with scales the color of dried blood and claws that could cut through ship armor, and a face that looked like someone had tried to make a lizard and a shark have a baby and then made that baby angry. The Vraxian was holding a chain, and at the end of that chain was a creature Kira had only seen in classified briefings and warning documents. It was a Karth. Even as a juvenile, the thing was terrifying to look at. Standing about waist-high, the Kira, with fur as black as the space between stars and 4 limbs that ended in claws curved like hooks, and a mouth that hung slightly open to reveal rows of teeth, designed by evolution for one purpose. Only the Korath were legendary across the galaxy, apex predators from a death world called Korath Prime, where everything was trying to kill everything else all the time. And they had built a civilization anyway, carved it out of the bones of lesser predators, and defended it with a ferocity that made other species tell stories about them in whispers. No one traded with the Korath. No one visited their space, and no one had seen one of their young outside their territory in living memory until now. Cub was muzzled with a device that looked painful. Metal bands wrapped around its snout and locked behind its head, and Kira could see scars on its body. Old wounds that had healed badly, and new wounds that had not healed at all. And its ribs showed through its fur in a way that told her it had not eaten properly in a very long time. But its eyes were what made Kira unable to look away. They were amber-colored, bright like fire, and they were not the eyes of an animal. They held intelligence and fury, and something else that Kira recognized because she had seen it in the mirror. During the worst times of her life, those eyes held pain that had not broken into despair. Not yet, and defiance that had not broken into submission. Not yet, and somewhere deep underneath all of that, barely visible, was hope that had not quite died. Rare specimen, the Vraxian shouted to the crowd, his voice booming through the translator as a harsh metallic bark. Korath juvenile, perfect for fighting pits, perfect for private collections, perfect for anyone who wants to own the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The crowd murmured and shifted, and Kira saw several aliens reach for their credit chips. And she saw others back away because even a juvenile Korath was not something most species wanted to be near. "How did you get it?" someone called out. A small furry creature that Kira did not recognize, the Vraxian, grinned, showing teeth that were almost as impressive as the cub's, and said, "Found a damaged ship drifting near the border of their space. Crew was dead, but this little prize was still alive in a cargo hold, probably being transported somewhere, probably by someone who is not around to complain about me taking it." The cub growled through its muzzle, a sound that vibrated in Kira's chest and made several members of the crowd take another step back. And the Vraxian yanked on the chain hard enough to make the cub stumble. Something inside Kira snapped. She had joined the diplomatic corps because she believed in building bridges between species, in finding common ground where others saw only differences, in proving that the galaxy did not have to be a place where the strong simply took what they wanted from the weak. She had seen too many beings treated as things, as property, as less than what they were, and every time she saw it, something inside her burned. She stepped forward before she could think about what she was doing, and she heard her own voice say, "How much?" The Vraxian looked down at her, and his tongue flicked out to taste the air. And Kira knew he was reading her biochemistry, sensing her heartbeat and her hormone levels, and all the other signals that told him she was serious. "For a human," he said slowly, drawing out the words like he was savoring them. 50,000 credits. Final offer. It was robbery. It was extortion. It was more money than Kira was supposed to spend on anything without approval from her superiors back on Earth. It was also everything in her discretionary fund, the emergency money she was allowed to use at her own judgment in situations that required immediate action. She thought about the paperwork she would have to file, the explanation she would have to give, the possibility that her career might be over if she could not justify this decision. Then she looked at the cub again, at those amber eyes that were now fixed on her with an expression she could not read. "Done," she said. The crowd went silent. The transfer of credits happened quickly, numbers moving from Kira's account to the Vraxian's with a soft chime from her wrist device. And then the merchant was pressing the chain into her hand with a grin that showed far too many teeth. "Good luck, human," he said, and his voice carried a tone that sounded like he was already planning how to spend money he expected to inherit when she died. They say Korath cubs can tear through steel plating when they get angry, and this one gets angry often. Kira ignored him and looked down at the cub, who was now staring up at her with those burning amber eyes, and she could feel the weight of every alien in the crowd watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. The cub growled. It was a sound unlike anything Kira had ever heard before, low and rumbling, and somehow it seemed to vibrate in her bones rather than just in her ears. And she felt her heart rate spike as millions of years of human evolution screamed at her to run away from the predator that was clearly about to attack behind her. She heard several aliens scramble backward, and the Vraxian laughed nervously as he put more distance between himself and the transaction he had just completed. "See what I mean?" he called out. "Pure killer instinct. That one will have your throat out before you can blink. Better keep a tight grip on that chain." But Kira was not listening to him anymore. She was looking at the cub, really looking, past the teeth and the claws and the growl that was designed by nature to trigger fear responses in prey species. And she was seeing something else entirely. She was seeing a child who had been taken from its home and put in chains and starved and beaten and dragged across the galaxy to be sold as a curiosity or a weapon. A child who had every reason to hate and fear everything around it. A child who was growling because growling was the only defense it had left. Kira did something that made the crowd gasp. She knelt down the movement, brought her face level with the cub, put her soft human throat within easy reach of those terrible teeth. And she heard someone in the crowd say something in a language her translator rendered as The human has gone insane. The cub's growl deepened, became louder, and Kira could see the muscles in its shoulders bunching as it prepared to lunge at her. And she knew that if it attacked, she would not be fast enough to stop it, but she did not move. Instead, she reached out slowly with her free hand, the one not holding the chain, and she turned her palm upward in a gesture that humans had used for thousands of years to show they meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quietly, keeping her voice soft and steady. "I'm not afraid of you." The cub's ears, which had been flat against its skull, twitched slightly forward. "I know you have been through terrible things," Kira continued, still not moving, still keeping her hand extended, and her body relaxed even though every muscle wanted to tense up and prepare for the attack that her instincts insisted was coming. "I know you have no reason to trust anyone, especially not some strange alien who just bought you like you were cargo." The growl faltered for just a moment before resuming. "But I did not buy you to own you," Kira said. And she meant every word. "I bought you because no living being should be chained and sold. And I'm going to take this muzzle off your face right now, and if you want to run away after that, I will not stop you, and if you want to attack me, well, I guess we will find out what happens." She reached up toward the muzzle with slow, deliberate movements, giving the cub every chance to see what she was doing. And her fingers found the release mechanism that held the metal bands in place. Raxian made a sound of alarm somewhere behind her, and she heard him say, "That thing will kill her the second she takes that off." And she heard other aliens agreeing with him. Kira pressed the release. The muzzle fell away, clattering against the metal floor of the station. And the cub's mouth was free for the first time in who knew how long. The crowd went completely silent. The cub's lips pulled back from its teeth, revealing the full horror of its natural weapons, serrated edges that gleamed under the station's artificial lights. And its growl became a snarl that made Kira's translator implant buzz with an untranslatable warning. She did not move. She kept her hand extended, palm up, and she looked into those amber eyes without flinching. And she waited. Seconds passed that felt like hours. Then the cub did something that made the watching aliens gasp again. It stopped growling. The snarl faded from its face, and its lips covered its teeth again, and it looked at Kira with an expression that seemed almost confused, as if she had done something it could not understand. Slowly, carefully, like it was expecting a trap, the cub leaned forward and pressed its nose against her palm. Its fur was softer than she had expected, and she could feel its breath warm against her skin. And then it made a sound she had never heard in any recording or briefing about the Korath species. It was a low rumble, almost like a purr, almost like a cat that had decided to trust someone against all reason and evidence. Kira felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back because she did not want to alarm the cub with sudden movements. "There you go," she whispered. "See, I told you I was not going to hurt you." The cub pressed closer, and she felt its head bump against her shoulder in a gesture that felt almost like affection. And the rumbling purr grew louder behind her. The Vraxian merchant made a sound of utter disbelief and said something her translator could not fully render, but which seemed to express confusion about why he was not watching. A human being eaten alive right now. Kira ignored him. She was too busy realizing that she had just made a promise to this creature, a promise to protect it and care for it and help it find its way home if that was what it wanted. And she had no idea how she was going to keep that promise, but she knew she was going to try. She reached up with her other hand and dropped the chain on the ground. The cub looked at the chain, then looked at her, and something in its eyes changed. Some wall coming down that she had not even realized was there. "Come on," Kira said softly, standing up slowly and gesturing toward the edge of the crowd. "Let us get out of here and find you something to eat. You look like you have not had a proper meal in far too long." The cub followed her without hesitation, staying close to her side. and the crowd parted before them like water flowing around stones, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Kira Vasquez knew that her life had just changed forever, even if she did not yet understand how. 3 months had passed since the day in the market, and Kira's life had become something she could not have imagined in her wildest dreams or her darkest nightmares, depending on which moment you asked her about. She had named the cub Shadow because of the way it followed her everywhere, always just a step behind, always watching, always present like a dark reflection that had decided to attach itself to her permanently. Shadow had grown in those 3 months, fed properly for the first time in what must have been a very long while, and the cub now stood as high as Kira's shoulder, a mountain of black fur and muscle that made other beings cross to the opposite side of corridors when they saw her coming. But the growth that surprised Kira most was not physical. Shadow was learning to speak human speech was not easy for Korath throats, which were designed for growls and roars rather than the subtle sounds that humans used to communicate. But Shadow was determined, practicing words over and over again until they came out right. And every new word mastered felt like a small miracle. The first word had been Kira, spoken in a rough approximation of her name that had made her cry for reasons she still did not fully understand. The second word had been safe, and Shadow had said it while pressing close to her during a loud thunderstorm on a planet they were visiting for diplomatic purposes. The third word had been home, and Shadow had looked at her when saying it, not at any direction that might point toward Korath space. And Kira had understood what that meant, even though she tried not to think about it too hard. Superiors on Earth were furious with her, sending message after message demanding explanations and threatening consequences, and using words like unauthorized expenditure and diplomatic incident waiting to happen. But they had not recalled her yet, partly because she was good at her job, and partly because firing the woman who had somehow tamed the Korath would have been a public relations disaster. Then the real message came, the one that changed everything. The Korath Dominion had made contact with human space for the first time in 300 years. They were not declaring war, which was what everyone had expected, and they were not demanding tribute, which was what everyone had feared. They wanted to meet the human who had bonded with one of their young. Kira stood in the docking bay of Earth's main orbital station, watching through the reinforced glass as the Korath ship approached, and she felt Shadow pressing against her side. The cub's body tense with something she could not identify. The ship was beautiful in a terrifying way, all angles and edges and surfaces that seemed designed to tear through anything that got in its path. And it was much larger than she had expected, large enough to carry a small army, if that was what it held. "Are you afraid?" she asked Shadow quietly. The cub made a sound that Kira had learned to interpret as thoughtful consideration before answering. "Not afraid, confused. Do not remember much of before, was very young when taken. Do not know what Korath are like. Whatever happens," Kira said, "I am not going to let anyone take you anywhere you do not want to go." Shadow pressed closer and said, "Know this is why not afraid." The ship docked with a sound of metal meeting metal, and Kira watched as the airlock cycled through its safety protocols. And then the inner door opened, and the Korath delegation stepped through. There were 7 of them, all adults. And Kira had thought Shadow was intimidating, but these creatures made the cub look like a kitten by comparison. They were massive, easily 9 feet tall, covered in fur that ranged from black to gray to a deep brown color. And they moved with a grace that seemed impossible for beings their size. Each step silent and precise, and carrying the promise of violence held carefully in check. The leader was a female. Kira could tell from the briefing materials she had studied obsessively since learning about the meeting. And she had scars across her face that told a story of battles survived and enemies defeated. The female's amber eyes so much like shadows, swept across the docking bay and found Kira immediately. And for a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then the female spoke, her voice coming through Kira's translator as flat, mechanical tones that could not capture whatever emotion lay beneath the words. I am Vexroth, War Speaker of the Dominion Council, and I have come to see the impossible thing that the reports describe. Kira stepped forward, keeping her posture straight and her voice steady, and said, I am Ambassador Kira Vasquez of Earth, and I welcome you to human space. I hope we can speak as friends rather than enemies. Vexrath made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a threat. And she said, we shall see what we shall see, human. But first, I would look upon the cub. Shadow stepped forward without waiting for Kira to say anything, moving to stand beside her rather than behind her. And Kira could hear the low rumble building in the cub's chest. Not quite a growl, but not quite that purring sound. Either Vexroth studied Shadow with eyes that seemed to see everything. And then she turned to one of the other Korath and spoke in a language Kira's translator could not render. A series of growls and clicks that went back and forth for several moments. Finally, Vexroth looked at Kira again and said, the cub has formed a pact bond with you. This is not supposed to be possible. Pact bonds are sacred among our people, and they are only formed between Korath. I do not know anything about pact bonds, Kira admitted. I only know that Shadow chose to trust me, and I chose to be worthy of that trust. Shadow, Vexroth repeated. Tasting the word, you gave it a human name. I gave Shadow a name that Shadow seemed to like, Kira said. Would you prefer I had not? Vexroth was silent for a moment. And then she did something that made her entire delegation shift with visible surprise. She laughed. It was a rough sound, full of edges, but it was unmistakably a laugh. And when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its mechanical flatness. You have courage, human, or you have madness. And I am not yet certain which, but I will tell you this. When we received reports that one of our lost young had bonded with an alien species, there were those on the council who wanted to come here with warships instead of diplomats. What changed their minds? Kira asked. Vexroth's S glittered with something. That might have been amusement. I told them that any species brave enough or foolish enough to bond with a Korath cub deserved to be investigated before being destroyed. And now that I have met you, I find myself curious about what other impossible things humans might be capable of. Shadow spoke then, the words rough but clear, and every Korath in the delegation went absolutely still when they heard them. Pack Mother is not foolish. Pack Mother is strong in ways Korath do not understand. Pack Mother looked at me and did not see monster, did not see weapon. Saw me. Vexroth stared at Shadow for a long moment. And then she turned to look at Kira with an expression that the translator could not interpret, but which felt something like respect. Pack Mother, she said slowly. That is what it calls you. That is what I try to be. Kira answered simply. The docking bay was silent, except for the hum of the station systems. And Kira could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The sense that something important was happening, even if she could not yet see its shape finally. Vexroth spoke again. We have much to discuss. Ambassador Kira Vasquez, Pack Mother to a child of the Dominion. And I think these discussions will be far more interesting than I expected them to be. The diplomatic meeting stretched over 2 weeks, and during that time, Kira watched Vexroth and her delegation study humans with an intensity that would have been frightening if it had been directed at her alone. They watched everything. The way humans walked and talked and ate and slept. The way human children played in the station's recreation areas. The way human soldiers trained in the gymnasium. The way human scientists worked in their laboratories. Vexter spent hours accessing human historical databases. reading through thousands of years of records with a focus that never seemed to waver. And Kira noticed that she kept returning to certain topics over and over again: animals. Specifically, the relationship between humans and animals throughout history. On the 14th day, Vexroth requested a formal meeting with the full human diplomatic delegation. And something in her voice when she made the request told Kira that this was going to be important. They gathered in the station's main conference room, a space designed to impress visitors with its view of Earth floating blue and beautiful against the black velvet of space. And the human delegation sat on one side of a long table, while the Korath delegation sat on the other. Shadow sat beside Kira, as always, and she noticed that Vexrath's eyes kept drifting to the cub throughout the preliminary formalities. Finally, when the formalities were done, Vexrath stood and activated a holographic display that floated above the center of the table. "I have spent many cycles studying your species," she said, her translator rendering the words with what Kira had learned to recognize as grave seriousness. "And I have reached a conclusion that I must share with this assembly." She pressed a control, and the holographic display showed an image that made several of the human delegates smile. Despite the tension in the room, it was a picture of a human child hugging a golden retriever. When we first learned of the bond between Ambassador Vasquez and the cub called Shadow, Vexrath continued, "we assumed it was an anomaly, a strange accident that could not be explained or repeated. And some among us believed it was a trick of some kind, a deception designed to gain advantage over the Dominion." She pressed another control, and more images appeared. Humans with cats, humans with horses, humans riding elephants, humans swimming with dolphins, humans standing next to lions and tigers and bears with expressions of affection rather than fear. But then I began to study your history, and I discovered something that changed my understanding completely. Vexrath zoomed in on an image of an ancient human standing beside a wolf, both of them looking out at something beyond the frame of the picture. 40,000 of your years ago, your ancestors looked at wolves, one of the most effective pack hunters on your planet. And instead of running away or fighting to the death, they somehow convinced these predators to live alongside them, to hunt with them, to protect their young and share their food and sleep beside their fires. She switched to another image, this one showing a human on horseback. You did the same thing with horses, massive creatures that could crush a human with a single kick. And you climbed onto their backs and rode them across continents and into battles that shaped the fate of your world. More images flashed across the display. Humans with hawks perched on their arms, humans surrounded by herds of cattle, humans with snakes draped over their shoulders, humans hand-feeding sharks and crocodiles and creatures that looked like they came from nightmares. "We made an error," Vexrath said, and her voice had taken on a tone that Kira had never heard from a Korath before, something that sounded almost like awe. "We looked at your species and saw weak creatures with no claws and no fangs and soft skin that could be torn by the smallest blade. And we assumed you were prey." She turned to face the human delegation directly, and her amber eyes blazed with an intensity that made several of them lean back in their chairs. "You are not prey." The room was absolutely silent. "You are the galaxy's apex adopters," Vexrath continued. "You do not flee from predators, you befriend them. You do not avoid dangerous creatures. You invite them into your homes and give them names and teach them to love you." She pointed at Shadow, who had been listening with ears perked forward and eyes wide. "The cub growled at you, Ambassador Vasquez. A threat display that triggers flight responses in 97% of known sentient species. And your response was to kneel down and remove its restraints and offer trust. This is not courage as we understand it. This is something else entirely." A human general in the back of the room, an older man with gray hair and a face full of scars from conflicts, Kira did not know about, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Vexroth turned to look at him and said, "You wish to add something?" "Soldier." The general stood up, still wearing that half-smile, and said, "Ma'am, with respect. You should see what we did with wolves. We did not just befriend them. We spent thousands of years carefully breeding them till we had hundreds of different varieties. Some small enough to fit in a pocket, some fluffy enough to look like clouds with legs, and some specifically designed to be so cute that humans would feel compelled to protect them, even though those same humans could easily protect themselves." He pulled out a small device and projected an image of a pug puppy onto the display. "We turned apex predators into this," he said, "on purpose, because we thought it would be nice to have something small and silly to love." Vexroth stared at the image for a long moment, and then she turned to look at Kira with an expression that the translator still could not render, but which felt like a mix of horror and fascination, and something that might have been respect. "Your species is terrifying," she said finally, "not because you are strong, though you are stronger than we initially believed, and not because you are clever, though your cleverness has clearly served you well. You are terrifying because you look at something dangerous, something that would kill any rational species, and your first instinct is to make it family." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "The cub chose well when it chose you, Ambassador Vasquez, and I begin to understand why." Shadow made that purring sound and pressed against Kira's side, and she reached down to scratch behind the cub's ears without thinking about it, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past months. Vexroth watched this with eyes that missed nothing, and then she turned to address the full assembly once more. "I came here expecting to find an anomaly," she said. "Instead, I have found a species that may be the most unexpectedly dangerous beings in the galaxy, and I do not mean that as an insult. I mean it as the highest compliment my people know how to give." She looked at Kira one more time. "The Dominion Council will hear my report, and I will recommend that we pursue alliance rather than conflict with your species, because the Karth have always respected strength, and I have come to believe that the strength of humans lies in their impossible, irrational, magnificent capacity to care about things they should fear." The general in the back was definitely laughing now, though he was trying to hide it behind his hand. "Welcome to humanity," he said. "We pet the murder creatures and call them good boys." 6 months after Vexroth's visit, Kira stood at a podium in the Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly, addressing representatives from over 200 species who had gathered to witness something that many of them had believed impossible. The formal alliance between humanity and the Karth Dominion. Shadow stood at her right side, fully grown now and absolutely magnificent, a creature of nightmare and legend that could tear through starship armor with claws and teeth, designed by millions of years of evolution for exactly that purpose. But Shadow was not standing in a combat stance, was not growling or threatening or doing any of the things that Korath were famous for throughout the galaxy. Shadow was purring, that deep rumbling sound that Kira had first heard in a crowded market on a distant station, and occasionally leaning against her in a way that made several delegates in the front row shift nervously in their seats. Kira delivered her prepared speech about cooperation and mutual respect, and the bright future that awaited species willing to look past their differences and find common ground. And she meant every word of it. But she knew that the speech was not what anyone would remember about this day. What they would remember was the sight of a small human woman standing beside one of the most feared predators in the galaxy, and both of them looking perfectly comfortable with the arrangement after the ceremony. After the documents were signed and the holographic recorders were turned off, and the delegates began filtering out to discuss what they had witnessed, Kira found herself alone with Shadow in a quiet observation lounge overlooking the stars. She was tired. The deep kind of tired that came from months of negotiations and public appearances and constantly being watched by beings who were trying to figure out what made her special. And all she wanted was a few minutes of peace. Shadow curled around her on the large couch she had chosen, specifically because it could hold them both. And the warmth of the massive body against hers was more comforting than she could have explained to anyone who asked. "Pack Mother," Shadow said. The words much clearer now than they had been 6 months ago. Other species ask me same question. Over and over. "What question?" Kira asked, running her fingers through the soft fur behind Shadow's ears. They ask why I chose human. Why not stay with Korath when Vexwrath offered to take me back to the Dominion? Why choose soft, small creature over my own kind? Kira felt something tighten in her chest. A fear she had carried since the moment Vexwrath had made that offer, and Shadow had refused it without hesitation. "What do you tell them?" she asked quietly. Shadow was silent for a moment, and then lifted that massive head to look at her with eyes that glowed amber in the dim light of the lounge. "I tell them truth," Shadow said. "I tell them Korath taught me to hunt. Korath taught me to fight. Korath taught me that galaxy is dangerous and only the strong survive." The words hung in the air, and Kira waited, knowing there was more. "But human taught me something Korath never could," Shadow continued. "Human taught me that being soft is not being weak. That protecting something smaller does not make you less. That gentleness is not same thing as helplessness." Shadow's chest rumbled with what Kira had learned to recognize as laughter. A sound that no xenobiologist had ever recorded because no one had ever gotten close enough to a happy Korath to hear it. "I tell them most dangerous creature in galaxy is not one with biggest claws or sharpest teeth." Shadow said, "Most dangerous creature in galaxy is one that looks at predator and sees friend. That reaches towards something that could kill it and offers trust. That refuses to let fear decide what is possible." Kira felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "And she did not try to stop them, Shadow," she said. And her voice cracked on the name Pack Mother cries. Shadow observed. "This means strong emotions. I learned this. Human crying is not weakness. It's feeling too much to contain." "Yes," Kira managed to say. "Yes. That is exactly what it is." Shadow pressed that massive head against her shoulder. So gently, so carefully, with such obvious concern about not hurting her. And Kira wrapped her arms around as much of the huge creature as she could reach and held on. "Galaxy is afraid of Korath," Shadow said softly. "And now Galaxy will be afraid of humans too. But for different reason. Korath are feared because we destroy. Humans will be feared because you love, because you adopt, because you look at monster and see family." Outside the observation window, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and somewhere out there, Kira knew, other species were already discussing what they had witnessed today, trying to understand what it meant that humans had allied themselves with the deadliest predators in known space. They would come up with theories, she knew. They would talk about military advantage and political maneuvering and the balance of power between galactic factions, and they would all miss the point. The point was not strategy or advantage or power. The point was that a malnourished cub in a crowded market had growled at a strange alien creature, and that alien creature had knelt down and offered kindness instead of fear. And everything else had followed from that single moment. "Shadow," Kira said, when she could trust her voice again, "do you ever regret it? Choosing to stay with me instead of going back to your own people?" Shadow made that purring sound again, louder now, filling the room with its warmth. "Pack Mother asks strange questions," Shadow said. "Korath are my species, but humans are my people now. You are my people. Wherever you go, I go. This is what pack bond means. This is what family means." Shadow paused, and then added in a tone that was definitely teasing, Besides, Korath do not give good ear scratches. Humans have perfect fingers for ear scratches. This is very important evolutionary advantage. Kira laughed. Really laughed, for the first time in months. And Shadow's purr grew even louder at the sound outside. The galaxy spun on, full of predators and prey and species that had not yet learned the lesson that Vexroth had carried back to the Dominion Council. Humans were not dangerous because they were strong. Though they were stronger than they looked, humans were not dangerous because they were clever. Though their cleverness had carried them to the stars, humans were dangerous because they cared, because they looked at monsters and saw friends, looked at predators and saw family, looked at the vast cold universe and decided that it needed more love in it. And one by one, the monsters were starting to agree. Kira held her impossible family close and watched the stars. And for the first time in a very long while, the future looked bright, not because it would be easy, because it would not be easy. There would be challenges and conflicts and beings who could not understand what humans and Korath had built together. But because she was not facing that future alone, because somewhere along the way, a growl had become a purr, and fear had become trust. And a diplomatic incident had become the most important relationship of her life, and that, Kira thought, was the most human thing of all, finding family in the most unexpected places, and holding on with both hands. No matter what the galaxy threw at them, Shadow rumbled contentedly against her, already half asleep, perfectly at peace in a way that a Korath cub for sale in a market cage could never have imagined. And Kira smiled and closed her own eyes, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, pack mother and pack child. Human and Korath, soft and strong family.